The courtroom was filled with tense silence. Judge Richard Harper, a black man known for his strict demeanor, was preparing to start the hearing. He had no idea that an ordinary day would change his life forever. Three boys, identical in appearance, approached the stand. Their faces were serious, but their eyes revealed a hint of unease. One of them looked the judge straight in the eye and firmly said, "We are your sons." Richard froze. His gaze shifted between the boys. His heart stopped for a moment, then began to race. Shock and confusion overwhelmed him, and suddenly tears welled up in his eyes. What happened next? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear the rest of this incredible story. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation as Judge Richard Harper entered, his robes flowing behind him. His presence commanded respect. He was a figure of authority who had spent years building an impeccable reputation. The gavel in his hand symbolized more than just justice. It represented his unyielding determination to rise above the barriers that life had placed before him. Richard Harper was no stranger to prejudice. From his first days in law school, he had faced skepticism, side glances, and the subtle but cutting undercurrent of racism that shadowed every achievement. Yet, he had refused to let the world define him by his skin color. Each case he presided over, each verdict he delivered, was another step toward proving that integrity and fairness could transcend bias. This day felt no different. The docket was full, and the cases varied from petty theft to civil disputes. The room was alive with whispers as attorneys shuffled papers and clients anxiously awaited their turn. Harper, as always, moved with precision. His tone was measured, his words clear and firm. To those in the gallery, he seemed unshakable, a man who had seen it all. But beneath his composed exterior, Richard carried the weight of his past. The road to the bench had been paved with countless sacrifices. He remembered the nights spent poring over law books, the family gatherings missed, the personal relationships strained under the pressure of his ambition. Each success had come at a cost, but Richard never allowed himself to dwell on regrets. To him, regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. As the session progressed, Richard dealt with each case methodically. He listened intently, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Yet, for all his professionalism, there was a warmth beneath the surface. He took pride in his role, believing that justice, when served correctly, could heal as well as discipline. To many, Richard Harper was the embodiment of resilience. A black man in a position of power, he was both a beacon of hope and a target of scrutiny. He was aware of the unspoken expectations placed upon him. Any misstep, no matter how small, could be magnified. It was an unrelenting pressure, but he bore it without complaint, using it as fuel to maintain his high standards. The courtroom felt like his sanctuary. Here, the rules were clear, the argument structured, and the truth, or at least the closest version of it, revealed. But today, as he called the next case, an inexplicable feeling settled in his chest. Something about the air felt different, heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The large double doors of the courtroom creaked open, breaking the usual rhythm of the proceedings. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound, curiosity rippling through the room. Standing in the doorway were three boys, each seemingly a mirror image of the others. Their identical features, dark, curious eyes, round faces framed by short-cropped hair, were impossible to ignore. They couldn't have been more than 12 years old, and yet their expressions carried a seriousness that seemed far beyond their years. The room fell silent. It wasn't unusual for minors to be present in the courtroom, but these boys exuded a presence that was hard to describe. It was as though they belonged to the same space and yet were starkly out of place. Their well-worn clothes, slightly too big for their small frames, hinted at a life that had seen its share of hardships. Judge Harper's gaze settled on them, his sharp eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The boys didn't shuffle nervously or hesitate, they walked toward the front of the room with a purpose that defied their age. Their identical movements, as if they had rehearsed this moment, only added to the growing sense of intrigue. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. "Who are they?" someone whispered. "What are they doing here?" Another voice, quieter but tinged with judgment, muttered, "They don't look like they belong here." The bailiff looked to Judge Harper for guidance, but the judge held up a hand, signaling him to stand down. Harper leaned forward slightly, his usually stoic expression softening into one of cautious curiosity. He had presided over countless cases, seen a variety of faces and stories pass through his courtroom, but something about these boys struck a chord deep within him. As they reached the front, the tallest of the three, a boy whose slight build couldn't hide his determined demeanor, stepped forward. He looked directly at Judge Harper, his gaze unwavering. There was no fear, no hesitation, just an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Your Honor," the boy began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion that hinted at how much this moment meant. "We're here because we need to speak with you. It's important." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you represented by counsel?" he asked, his voice measured and calm, though a flicker of something, uncertainty, crept into his tone. The boy shook his head. "No, sir. We don't need a lawyer for this." A ripple of murmurs spread again, but the boy's voice cut through it like a knife. "We're here because you need to know something about us." Judge Harper's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the bench, a rare tell of his growing unease. "And what would that be?" he asked, his voice firm yet curious. The boy hesitated, glancing at his brothers for support. They nodded subtly, their identical faces reflecting the same resolve. Then, with a deep breath, he looked back at the judge and said the words that would change everything. "We're your sons." The room erupted. Gasps filled the air, and the murmurs turned to outright exclamations of shock and disbelief. Judge Harper's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but no words came. His eyes darted between the three boys, each one looking at him with an intensity that burned through the confusion in the room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The weight of their statement hung in the air, impossible to ignore, and for the first time in his career, Judge Harper felt utterly unprepared. The world around him blurred, the faces of the spectators fading into the background as his focus remained fixed on the three boys standing before him. They weren't just here to make a claim. They were here to shatter his reality. The courtroom, which moments ago had been buzzing with quiet whispers and shifting papers, fell into a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the air. The words hung in the space between the bench and the boys, simple yet earth-shattering, "We are your sons." Judge Richard Harper's hand, poised to pick up his gavel, froze midair. His sharp, professional demeanor cracked, revealing an expression rarely seen on his face, raw, unfiltered shock. His eyes widened, flickering from one boy to the next, each identical face confirming what his mind refused to process. Time seemed to stand still as the weight of their statement settled over the room. The murmurs in the gallery, which usually subsided under his authoritative gaze, now grew louder. Spectators craned their necks to get a better look at the trio standing before the judge. The bailiff, who had been standing at attention near the door, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the boys and then back at Harper as if seeking direction. But no direction came. Richard felt his chest tighten, a storm of emotions brewing inside him. Shock turned to confusion, then to fear, then to something deeper, an aching, primal pull he couldn't quite name. The words echoed in his mind, each repetition sinking deeper into his consciousness. "We are your sons." He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Instead, memories flooded in, unbidden and vivid. A warm smile framed by soft curls. A hand resting gently on his chest as they whispered dreams of a shared future. the cries of a newborn. And then, the emptiness that had followed. Richard's grip tightened around the edge of the bench as he tried to steady himself. He searched the boys' faces, desperate for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And there it was, in their eyes, a flicker of recognition, a connection so undeniable it sent a chill down his spine. The tallest boy, the one who had spoken, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the judge's gaze. "It's true," he said, his voice softer now but still steady. "We didn't know how else to tell you. But we've been looking for you, for a long time." Richard's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't since his earliest days as a young attorney fighting for respect in a world that doubted him. But this wasn't a courtroom battle. This was personal, a confrontation with a truth he hadn't even known was out there. "Why?" he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. He swallowed hard, trying again. "Why now? Why here?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his brothers for support. The middle one, smaller but with the same determined expression, stepped forward. "We didn't have anywhere else to go," he said simply. "And we thought you should know." The youngest boy, barely holding back tears, added in a whisper, "Mom always said you were a good man." That single sentence broke something inside Richard. His jaw clenched as he tried to process the flood of emotions overwhelming him, grief for the years lost, guilt for not knowing, and an inexplicable, overwhelming need to protect these boys who stood before him claiming to be his. The courtroom watched, riveted, as the usually composed judge struggled to regain his footing. His mind raced with questions, but one thought rang out louder than the rest. Could it be true? Could they really be mine? Before he could ask, the eldest boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He stepped closer to the bench, his movements hesitant but purposeful, and placed it on the wooden surface in front of Richard. Richard stared at the image. It was worn, the edges frayed, but the faces were unmistakable. There she was, the woman he had once loved, holding 3 tiny bundles in her arms. And beside her, smiling nervously, was a younger version of himself. Richard felt the room spin, the edges of his vision blurring. The photograph trembled in his hand as he picked it up, the faces staring back at him like ghosts from a life he thought he had left behind. He closed his eyes, fighting to steady his breathing, but the boy's words rang louder than ever in his mind. "We are your sons." The photograph trembled in Richard's hand, its faded edges biting softly into his fingertips. The courtroom noises faded into the background, replaced by the rush of memories surging forward like an unstoppable tide. The faces in the image, hers, his, and the tiny bundles of life cradled in her arms, pulled him back to a time he had buried deep, a time when the world had felt both boundless and suffocating. Her name was Naomi, a name that still carried the weight of everything he had loved and lost. He could almost hear her laugh, a sound that had once been his favorite melody, blending seamlessly with the quiet evenings they spent dreaming about a life together. Naomi had a way of making the world seem softer, even when it was anything but. Her smile was radiant, her presence unyielding, and her love for him unconditional. But the world they lived in was not kind to love like theirs. Richard had always known the risks, the whispered judgments that followed them when they walked hand in hand. Even in the progressive circles he navigated, their relationship had been a topic of quiet disdain. A rising black attorney, respected and feared in the courtroom, with a black woman who wore her defiance of societal expectations like armor, together, they were a target. At first, they had ignored the stares and the murmurs. They had dreamed of a future where their love was enough to silence the noise. But the noise only grew louder. Colleagues who once praised Richard's sharp mind began to question his judgment. Invitations to dinners and networking events mysteriously stopped arriving. And then there were the comments, the insidious, backhanded remarks disguised as advice. You've got a bright future, Richard. Don't let personal choices derail it. Naomi had seen the toll it took on him, how the constant battle against prejudice had begun to erode his confidence. She had tried to shield him from it, even as she faced her own struggles. The judgment was harsher for her, as though she were the one corrupting his potential. When she became pregnant, the weight of their love's consequences grew unbearable. Richard could still remember the night she told him she was leaving. It had been late, the city lights casting long shadows across their small apartment. Naomi had been sitting by the window, her hands protectively cradling her growing belly. She looked beautiful and heartbroken, her gaze fixed on the world outside. "This isn't about love, Richard," she had said, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "I know you love me. And I love you. But love isn't enough. Not in this world." He had protested, his words tumbling out in desperation. "Naomi, we can fight this. We can make it work. Don't let them win." But she had only shaken her head, her expression pained yet resolute. "It's not about them winning. It's about you not losing. I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for. You're meant for great things, Richard. Things bigger than us." He had pleaded with her, begged her to stay, but her mind was made up. She left a month later, just after their sons were born. The only thing she left behind was a letter. Richard had memorized every word, though they haunted him to this day. "I'm doing this because I love you. You deserve a life free from the burden of my presence. Our sons will be safe, and you will have the career you deserve. Please don't try to find us. Remember me as someone who loved you too much to let you fall." For years, Richard had buried the memory, channeling his grief into his work. He convinced himself that focusing on his career was the only way to honor her sacrifice. But now, standing in a courtroom with the sons he never thought he'd see, her words echoed louder than ever. Looking at the boys, he saw Naomi in each of them, the tilt of their chins, the determination in their eyes, the unspoken strength they carried. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if he had made a mistake. If he should have fought harder, held on tighter. The realization hit him like a blow. No amount of success or respect could fill the void she had left. And now, standing before the boys who had been part of that sacrifice, Richard felt the weight of all the years lost to silence and regret. The memory of that morning was etched into Richard's mind with painful clarity, like a scar that never faded. The apartment was eerily quiet when he woke up, the kind of silence that felt wrong. Naomi was usually up before him, bustling around the small kitchen or humming softly as she cradled one of the boys. But that day, there was no hum, no soft clatter of dishes, only the oppressive stillness that made his chest tighten. At first, he thought she might have stepped out briefly. But as he walked through the apartment, calling her name, the truth began to unravel. The nursery door was ajar, the crib that once held the triplets now empty. His heart raced as he checked every corner, every room, only to find no sign of Naomi or the boys. What he did find, sitting on the dining table, was a neatly folded letter addressed to him. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his name written in Naomi's elegant script on the front. He stared at it for a moment, his mind refusing to accept what his heart already knew. Slowly, he unfolded the paper, and her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Richard. By the time you read this, we'll be gone. Please don't be angry. Please try to understand. This isn't about you or me, it's about them. Our boys deserve a chance at life without the weight of our choices dragging them down. I've seen the way people look at us, at them. I've heard the whispers, the judgments. And I can't let them grow up in a world that sees them as a burden, a mistake. You are an incredible man, and I have no doubt you'll go on to do great things. But the path you're on doesn't have room for us. I won't let our love be the thing that holds you back. I'm doing this because I love you too much to stay. Don't look for us, Richard. Let us go. Remember me as someone who believed in you, even when I couldn't be by your side. I'll always love you. Asterisk. The letter slipped from his hands, fluttering to the floor as he sank into a chair. A wave of emotions crashed over him: confusion, anger, heartbreak, and a deep, aching emptiness. How could she think he would ever choose his career over them? How could she believe that protecting his reputation meant more than keeping his family together? For weeks, he searched for her, his desperation growing with every dead end. He contacted friends, family, anyone who might know where she had gone, but Naomi had left no trail. It was as if she and the boys had vanished into thin air. The pain of their absence was a constant weight on his chest, a hollow ache that refused to fade no matter how much he threw himself into his work. His colleagues noticed the change in him. The once confident and charismatic attorney became quieter, more reserved. He buried himself in cases, using the law as a shield against his grief. Outwardly, he was thriving, winning case after case and building the career Naomi had believed in so fiercely. But inside, he was broken, haunted by the memories of what could have been. Every time he saw a family in the park or heard the laughter of children, he thought of them, 3 little boys with her eyes and his determination. He wondered if they were safe, if they were happy, if they even remembered him. The not knowing was the hardest part, a wound that time could never fully heal. Years passed, but the letter remained tucked away in a drawer, its edges worn from the countless times he had unfolded it, rereading her words as if searching for answers that weren't there. He told himself he had to move on, that Naomi's decision was final, but the ache in his heart never truly left. And now, standing in the courtroom, staring into the faces of the 3 boys who claimed to be his sons, Richard felt the weight of those lost years crash down on him. The pain of her departure, the emptiness of their absence, it all came flooding back, sharper and more overwhelming than ever. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this was his second chance. The 3 boys stood in the courtroom, their identical faces shadowed by years of struggle that belied their young age. Their voices trembled as they began to share their story, a story of separation, hardship, and a mother who had fought fiercely for their survival but ultimately left them with more questions than answers. "We didn't have much," began the eldest, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of memory. "Mom tried her best, but life wasn't easy. She worked all the time, cleaning houses, taking night shifts at diners, just to keep a roof over our heads. Even then, there were nights we went to bed hungry." The middle brother added, "We moved a lot. It felt like we were always running from something: late rent, landlords who didn't want kids, or just people who looked at us like we didn't belong." His voice grew quieter, but the anger in his tone was unmistakable. "Mom never told us why we had to leave so much. She said it was for the best, but we knew it was because people didn't want us there." The youngest boy, barely able to meet Judge Harper's gaze, spoke next. "At school, they called us names. Said we didn't belong. The teachers didn't stop it. Sometimes, they joined in, treating us like we were trouble just for being there." Richard's chest tightened as he listened, the weight of their words pressing heavily on him. He could see Naomi in their faces, in the way they spoke with quiet resilience, despite the pain they had endured. "She told us about you," the eldest continued, his tone softening. "Not much, but enough to know you existed. She said you were a good man, someone who would have loved us if things were different." The middle brother interjected, his voice tinged with bitterness. "But she never told us why you weren't there. Why we had to do all this alone." The youngest, his small hands gripping the edge of the podium, whispered, "We used to make up stories about you. Pretend you were a superhero or a king. That you'd come find us one day and take us somewhere safe. Their words hung in the air, heavy with longing and unspoken hurt. Richard felt an ache in his chest unlike anything he'd experienced before. He had spent years climbing the ranks, building a life of respect and authority, but he had been blind to the pain his absence had caused, pain that had etched itself into the lives of his sons. "Mom always told us to dream big," the eldest said, his voice cracking slightly. "But dreaming big didn't stop us from being hungry. It didn't stop the world from treating us like we didn't matter. But we kept dreaming," the youngest added, his voice gaining strength. "Dreaming that one day, we'd find you. That you'd be the dad we always hoped for." Their words broke something inside Richard. For years, he had lived with the regret of not searching harder, of not fighting to keep his family together. And now, hearing the truth of their lives, he realized just how much they had endured, how much they had lost because of choices that weren't their own. He wanted to speak, to offer some explanation or comfort, but the boys weren't finished. "When Mom got sick," the middle boy said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we thought she'd get better. She told us she would. But she didn't." The youngest wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She made us promise to find you. She said we'd know you when we saw you." The eldest stepped forward slightly, his gaze piercing through Richard's composure. "We didn't just come here because she told us to. We came because we need to know, are you the man she said you were?" Richard's throat tightened, his carefully constructed walls threatening to collapse entirely. The boys weren't just asking for answers, they were asking for hope, for a connection that had been missing their entire lives. As he looked at them, he saw not just the pain of their past, but the strength they had inherited from their mother. And in their eyes, he saw a question that demanded not just an answer, but a commitment. "Will you be the father we deserve?" Richard sat silently at the bench, the weight of the courtroom no longer measured in laws and verdicts but in the profound reality now staring back at him. The triplets stood before him, 3 boys who claimed to be his sons. The words they had spoken echoed in his mind, refusing to settle. "We're your sons." He had spent decades building his life, brick by brick, as an unshakable pillar of justice. His decisions were rooted in reason and fact, his reputation built on the foundation of unwavering impartiality. But this moment, this revelation, was unlike anything he had faced before. It wasn't just a case. It was personal. It was his life unraveling in front of him. Doubt clawed at him. Was it really possible? Could these boys, who carried Naomi's features so unmistakably, truly be his? The photograph they had presented didn't lie. Their eyes, their expressions, all of it reflected pieces of the past he had buried deep inside. But admitting it meant something much bigger than accepting them as his sons. It meant dismantling the fortress he had built around himself to survive in a world that had never been kind to men like him. He thought of the years he had spent fighting to earn his place in the justice system. As a black man, he had always been under the microscope, his every move scrutinized. One mistake, one perceived weakness, could have been enough to undo everything. And now, standing on the precipice of truth, he wondered if acknowledging these boys would shatter the life he had worked so tirelessly to construct. But then there was Naomi. Her voice, soft yet resolute, played in his mind. She had left to protect him, to shield him from the prejudice and judgment that their family would have inevitably faced. But had it been worth it? The boys' stories of hardship and loss told him otherwise. Naomi's sacrifice had been born of love, but it had left a void in all their lives. Richard's gaze shifted back to the boys. They were no longer speaking, but their eyes held the weight of 1,000 questions. They weren't just asking for acknowledgement, they were asking for a father. A man who could give them the stability and love they had longed for. A man they believed could fulfill the promise Naomi had made to them, even in her absence. But could he be that man? The doubt returned, gnawing at him. He had spent so many years convincing himself that his work was his legacy, that his role as a judge was the ultimate way to create change in the world. Now, he was faced with the possibility that his true legacy was standing right in front of him. He glanced at the courtroom, noting the eyes fixed on him, some curious, others judgmental. His colleagues would demand answers. The public would scrutinize his every action. Could he withstand the inevitable backlash? Would acknowledging these boys as his sons be the end of the life he had built? Yet, as the questions swirled, another truth emerged, quiet but undeniable. The life he had built was incomplete. It was a life of achievements and accolades, but it lacked the one thing he hadn't allowed himself to have: family. He had justified it as a necessary sacrifice, but now he realized it was a sacrifice he had never truly accepted. His gaze softened as it returned to the boys. Despite their young age, they carried themselves with a strength that belied their years. It was the same strength Naomi had shown when she made the impossible choice to leave. It was a strength that came from love, even when love demanded unimaginable pain. Richard took a deep breath, his mind no closer to clarity but his heart beginning to stir with an unfamiliar warmth. These boys, his sons, were not just asking for answers. They were asking for him. And as much as it frightened him, as much as it threatened to upend everything he had built, he couldn't deny them. The truth was no longer something he could escape. It was here, undeniable and unrelenting. The question wasn't whether he could accept it. The question was whether he had the courage to embrace it. His hands rested on the bench, his knuckles white against the dark wood. For the first time in his career, Richard Harper, the unflappable judge, felt completely vulnerable. But in that vulnerability, he also felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. The weight of the decision settled heavily on Judge Richard Harper's shoulders as he sat alone in his chambers, the walls around him adorned with diplomas and awards that now felt strangely hollow. The gavel, the symbol of his authority, rested on his desk, but for once it offered no guidance. He had spent his entire life navigating the intricacies of justice, but no legal precedent could prepare him for this. The truth was staring him in the face. Those boys were his. Every piece of evidence, Naomi's letter, the photograph, and most of all, the unshakable connection he felt when he looked into their eyes, made it undeniable. But admitting it meant stepping into uncharted territory. It meant inviting scrutiny and judgment, not only from the public but from the very system he had served faithfully for decades. When he emerged from his chambers the next day, his decision had been made. The courtroom was packed, the news of the previous day's revelation having spread like wildfire. Spectators and colleagues filled the seats, their whispers a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and judgment. Cameras from local media outlets lined the back of the room, their lenses trained on the man who had always been seen as untouchable. Richard's chest tightened as he stepped up to the bench. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him, dissecting his every move. But he forced himself to stand tall, his gaze steady as he addressed the room. "I have spent my career upholding the truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it may be," he began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. "And today, I am faced with a truth that is deeply personal. These boys are my sons." A gasp rippled through the room, followed by a flurry of murmurs. Richard let the noise settle before continuing. "I am not proud of the years they spent without me. I am not proud of the circumstances that led to this moment. But I will not deny them or the responsibility that comes with being their father." The boys, seated in the front row, looked at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For so long, they had dreamed of hearing those words, and now, they were real. As the session ended and Richard stepped down from the bench, he he was immediately surrounded by reporters, their questions sharp and unrelenting. "Why didn't you search for them sooner?" one asked. "Do you think this will affect your career?" another pressed. Richard met their questions with the same fortitude he had brought to every case. "The only thing that matters is doing what's right, for them and for myself. I will face whatever comes because they deserve nothing less." Behind the scenes, the reaction among his colleagues was mixed. Some expressed quiet support, admiring his courage to confront his past, while others whispered about how the revelation could tarnish his reputation. "How could you let this happen?" some asked, their voices tinged with judgment. "What does this say about his ability to lead?" The public response was equally polarized. Supporters praised him for stepping up, for embracing his family despite the potential fallout. But critics were louder, questioning his judgment and accusing him of hypocrisy. Social media became a battleground of opinions, with headlines like "The Judge and His Secret Sons, a Scandal or Redemption?" Dominating the news cycle. Richard, however, refused to waver. He had made his choice, and no amount of criticism could undo it. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his career. His focus shifted from maintaining his reputation to building a relationship with the boys who had been without a father for far too long. Late one evening, as he sat with the triplets in his modest home, Richard realized that the noise from the outside world no longer mattered. What mattered was the laughter echoing through the house, the stories the boys shared about their lives, and the tentative but growing bond they were building. The road ahead would not be easy. The world would continue to judge him, and the boys would face their own challenges. But Richard knew that he had made the right decision. He had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward healing, not just for himself, but for his family. The weight of his decision to acknowledge his sons was immense, but for Judge Richard Harper, it was only the beginning. As the public scrutiny grew and whispers of judgment echoed in the halls of the courthouse, Richard knew he couldn't let this moment end with a single admission. His sons' lives, the years of poverty, humiliation, and discrimination they endured, were not anomalies but reflections of a deeply flawed system. A system he had served for decades. A system that, in many ways, he had unwittingly upheld. For Richard, the revelation of his son's existence became a catalyst for change. He no longer saw his role as a judge solely as one of delivering verdicts but as an opportunity to challenge the very structure that had perpetuated the injustices they had faced. He began to re-examine every case, every precedent, every policy that had crossed his bench, now with the lens of a father who understood what systemic inequality could do to a family. His first step was using his platform to address the biases inherent in the legal system. He called for reforms in how juvenile cases, particularly those involving Black and minority children, were handled. Too often, he realized, children like his sons were seen as guilty before proven innocent, judged not by their actions but by the color of their skin and the circumstances of their upbringing. Richard's speeches began to gain attention. He spoke at legal conferences, town halls, and even schools, sharing the story of his sons, not as a scandal but as a lesson. "The law failed my family," he would say, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And it's time we make sure it doesn't fail others." The backlash was swift and harsh. Critics accused him of using his position to push a personal agenda. Headlines questioned his impartiality, labeling him as biased and unfit for the bench. Colleagues who once admired him now viewed him with suspicion, some even avoiding him in the hallways. But Richard remained undeterred. For every critic, there was a supporter, a mother who thanked him for speaking out, a young attorney inspired by his courage, a child who saw hope in his words. His sons, too, became part of his mission. Together, They visited community centers and advocacy groups, speaking to families who had suffered under the weight of an unjust system. The boys shared their experiences of growing up without a father, of facing prejudice and exclusion, and of the transformative power of being seen and acknowledged. One day, as they stood before a crowd at a rally for criminal justice reform, Richard looked at his sons and saw the strength they had inherited from their mother and the resilience they had forged on their own. They weren't just survivors of a broken system, they were voices for change, and he felt an overwhelming pride that he was now part of their journey. But Richard knew that speeches and advocacy weren't enough. He began to implement change from the bench, crafting sentences that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, advocating for alternatives to incarceration, and challenging attorneys to think beyond the confines of traditional justice. His rulings became case studies in law schools, sparking debates about the role of empathy in the judiciary. As his work gained momentum, Richard became a symbol of hope and resilience, not just for his family but for the community at large. His story reminded people that even those in positions of power could make mistakes, but they could also make amends. He showed that the fight for justice wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. Through it all, Richard remained humble, never losing sight of why he had started this journey. It wasn't for recognition or redemption, it was for his sons. For the years they had lost, for the pain they had endured, and for the future he wanted them to have. A future where they wouldn't just survive, but thrive in a world that saw them for who they were, not for the prejudices others projected onto them. In fighting for justice, Richard found a new purpose. And in doing so, he not only healed the wounds of his past, but also laid the foundation for a better, more equitable future for his family, his community, and the countless lives his work would touch. The days following Richard's public acknowledgement of his sons were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. The Harper household, once a quiet space defined by the solitude of Richard's career, now buzzed with the sounds of laughter, debate, and the occasional sibling argument. It was a cacophony he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder that life was fuller, messier, and more beautiful than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. The triplets, each carrying their unique personalities and experiences, began to settle into their new reality. They learned about their father's world, a world of law, justice, and rigorous discipline, and Richard, in turn, learned about theirs. He listened as they spoke about their late mother, their struggles, and their dreams. Each story, every shared moment, felt like another thread in the tapestry of a family finally being woven together. But their journey was not without its challenges. Public scrutiny lingered like a shadow, with reporters eager for updates and critics quick to dissect every move Richard made. The boys faced questions and stares at school, their newfound connection to a prominent judge drawing both admiration and skepticism. Yet, together, they navigated these obstacles with resilience, their bond growing stronger with each hurdle they overcame. Richard also faced moments of self-doubt, wondering if he could truly be the father they needed. But each time, the boys reminded him, through their trust, their laughter, and their simple presence, that he was enough. He found himself cherishing the small moments, cooking a clumsy pancake breakfast on a Sunday morning, helping with homework at the dining table, or sharing stories late into the night. As weeks turned into months, the Harper family began to carve out a new path. Richard used his position not just to rebuild his relationship with his sons, but to advocate for change. Inspired by their stories and the hardships they endured, he pushed for reforms in the legal system to address the very injustices that had kept them apart. His voice, already respected, now carried the weight of personal experience, and his efforts resonated far beyond the courtroom. The family's story became one of hope and transformation, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. It inspired conversations about race, equality, and the importance of standing up against prejudice. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences and finding solace in the Harper family's journey. In the quiet moments, Richard often reflected on how far they had come. Sitting on the porch one evening, watching his sons play basketball in the driveway, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The laughter of his boys, the golden glow of the setting sun, and the realization that they had become a family, it was all more than he could have ever hoped for. Their story wasn't perfect, nor was it finished. There were still struggles to face and wounds to heal. But they faced them together, with love as their anchor and the belief that they could create a better future for themselves and others. As their journey continued, it became clear that the Harpers were no longer defined by the past but by the strength they found in each other. They were living proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged and that love, when given the chance, could transform everything. If you've been inspired by the Harper family's incredible journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, hope, and humanity. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and thank you for being part of this story with us.